Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today on this video, I wanted to answer a viewer question. This one's from B Griffin 511. How do you decide between weightless, pegged, or unpegged weights for your flipping and pitching presentations? This is a really good question. I've done some videos on it in the past, but I feel like I can go even deeper on this topic. So we're gonna try to get as in-depth into, the decision making on when to peg or when not to peg your weights with a Texas rig. So what we're essentially talking about is when we're talking about pegging a weight to your line, essentially what we're talking about is making the weight stationary. It's not going to be moving around. So for instance, this right here is a Texas rig. We got the Z-Man bang sticks on there, and then we've got a floating bullet weight. Okay, this is something that when you're first learning a Texas rig, you're probably just gonna have it free floating on the line like this. Okay, so the weight can just go just about anywhere that it wants on the line. When you peg a weight, you're making it stationary. This is one way to peg a weight. This right here is what we call a bobber stop. You can see it there above the weight. That means that it cannot, wherever that bobber stop is, that weight can't go any further than that bobber stop. And that makes the weight and the bait pretty much one compact presentation. And when you peg a weight, that allows the weight and the presentation to fall through the water and fall through cover at the same speed. In a lot of cases, if you're using a free floating weight in heavy cover, the weight might go through that heavy cover like a brush pile or vegetation or something like that, while the bait is just sticking up there in no man's land or no fish land, where it's not going to get bit or even seen at all. So pegging is generally accepted as something that we do when you have heavy cover and you want that bait to get down there into that thick cover. The bobber stop is definitely one way to peg a weight onto your line. I'm going to show you another way. I use both of these techniques, and essentially you're going to be using a T-peg. Okay, these are rubber pegs. Back in the day, I remember when I first started, getting into bass fishing real hardcore and reading Bassmaster magazines and watching videos. Guys used to take toothpicks and stick them into the weights to peg the weights onto the line. You can imagine wood against fluorocarbon or monofilament or even braid, probably not the best, the best way to do this. So quickly after that became popular, they started coming out with these rubber T-pegs. These things, man, I buy them by the hundreds. I absolutely love using these. I do love using the bobber stops too, and I'm going to talk about like when I might choose one over the other. But essentially what you're going to do is you're going to take your worm weight, your little bullet sinker, and you're going to put this T-peg in the back, okay? So essentially from here, I might pull it up just a little bit till it's starting to get snug. And the strategy that I like to use is I like to trim the back, flush with the back of the weight, like so. And you can see there, we still got a little bit sticking out there. I want that flush with the bottom hole on the weight. So what I'm gonna do, now we still have this tag end on the front, okay? So we're gonna pull that little piece in, flush with the bottom, you can see there, and then we're going to trim the top flush right there. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. There we go. So that's how I use a T-peg. You can see it's completely stationary there. It's not like too much pressure to where you can't move it up and down the line, but there you go. You just snug it up to the nose of your bait and you have a perfectly pegged weight, just using a different method than the bobber stop. And I'm going to show you actually a bobber stop real quick because, you know, you might not be well versed on the bobber stop either, but essentially they're going to come into, come on one of these little things right here with a bunch of them on there. And these things have like wires or, you know, steel wire that the bobber stops are on, and then they got a loop at the back. So what you're going to do before you tie on your weight or any of this stuff, you know, your weight or your hook, you're going to go ahead and put on this bobber stop. So pretend like this end right here is going to my reel, okay? So what I'm going to be doing is put that line through that loop, and then if everything works properly, which I've had a lot of these that are just not, you know, the wires aren't anchored right, so you just go through the whole thing and you don't even get one onto the line. But you're essentially just going to pull your bobber stop onto the line there. You can see. So that's how you do it. And then you go ahead and tie your, put the weight on and then tie your hook on, and there you go. That is the bobber stop method. All right, so let's talk about, you know, when you might want to fish weightless or without pegging your weight to the line. You know, what situations might, you know, those be your choice. Really, weightless is a totally different thing, right? A lot of times, if the fish are really shallow and they're around isolated cover, or I'm like casting to the edge of cover or something like that, you don't really need the weight to be able to, you know, get through that cover, because you're not fishing in thick cover, you're fishing around the cover. So for instance, if I'm throwing like a stick bait, like a Z-Man Sinkers or something that, you know, has a nice shimmying fall on, you know, just by itself because it's loaded with salt. And this is really the only time that I weightless rig a bait, you know, is either fishing like a fluke style bait, you know, a soft plastic jerk bait, or a soft plastic stick bait that has a lot of salt content in it. Those are really the main ones. And then also floating worms. So there is a few categories of baits that I might use a weightless presentation with a Texas rig. But they are pretty limited. But generally, it's when you're fishing more open water, you're not trying to get that bait into heavier cover, because without a weight, it's just going to sit on top of that heavier cover. As soon as it makes contact with an object, it's not going to penetrate any deeper. So you want to make sure that you're using a weight in heavier cover situations. But, you know, if you're just casting around, you know, if you're skipping underneath docks with like a stick bait or something like that, there's probably a lot of open water underneath there, and it can kind of just, you know, fall naturally on its own. So there are plenty of situations when you might want to use a weightless presentation, but usually it's the prerequisite for it. The first question you have to ask yourself is, am I fishing this bait in heavy cover or trying to get deeper too? And so deeper water is a whole other scenario. Obviously, you're going to want a bait that has a little bit of weight to it. So you might want to use a Texas rig that has a free floating weight on it, okay? That's pretty much like that's how most people fished a Texas rig back in the day, is with a free floating weight that could just move up and down the line. If I'm fishing a Texas rig, say I'm like Texas rigging like a Mag Fatties or something. I thought I had a bag of Mag Fatties here, but just say I'm Texas rigging a worm out deep, fishing a ledge, or fishing real sparse cover, casting at like stumps out deep, or you know, not necessarily brush piles, but real non-dense cover, or just fishing structure. That's when I'll use a weight that is free floating on the line. You know, I don't really need the weight to be pegged, because I'm not you know, passing through heavy cover. I'm just fishing open water. And one of the great things about a free floating weight is it really does give a very unique and natural action to the bait that you're fishing. You know, if you're fishing a worm, it has more of kind of like an undulating flowing action when you have it unpegged, okay? So if you're fishing open water like ledges and stuff like that, a free floating worm weight is probably going to be the best bet. That's really when I like to use a free-floating worm weight. But as I've got older, when I'm Texas rigging, most of the time I'm pegging my weights, okay? Because a lot of times, you know, if I'm fishing ledges or something like that and I do want to fish a big worm, a lot of times I'm just going to be using a shaky head style jig head to begin with. I'll put a good option for like a big worm, a shaky head in the description below. There's one called the Secret Lures Lead Shaker that I love to use. And, you know, if I'm fishing that situation that I just talked about where I would fish a sliding bullet sinker, usually, you know, there's other ways of rigging a big worm that may be more advantageous, like that big shaky head or something like that. So I've kind of phased a lot of the sliding bullet sinker fishing out of my arsenal. Not completely, but a lot of it I have changed. But that's really up to you. I mean, again, there's no real right or wrong way to do things. So I don't want to, like, you know, say that you have to change, but I have changed over time, and those are the reasons why. So anyways, now the big question is, when should you use a bobber stop peg method versus a T-peg pegging method? All right, and I've kind of come up with my kind of choice on this through years of fishing, flipping and pitching. You know, the original question was all about flipping and pitching, but I felt like I needed to kind of touch up on other aspects of it. And what I have found is that when I'm punching, you know, really fishing thick vegetation with weights that are like 3/4 ounce or heavier, I really like to use the bobber stop for a couple reasons. Number one, the bobber stop allows me to use a flip-in bead like this, and it gives that weight just as much freedom of movement as I want. You know, you can pull that bobber stop apart a little bit and then put that bead in between the bait and the weight, and that little bit of movement that you get from the bobber stop allows this weight to kind of clack into it. And when I'm punching, I really do like to use those punch beads, those flipping beads a lot. And so whenever I'm using a flipping bead like that, either trying to make noise or trying to, you know, protect the knot, or just separate the big weight from the nose of the bait, like what I like to do when I'm punching, that's when I like to use the bobber stop. But the heavier weights also have another thing, that's usually a bigger hole. Okay, so a lot of times the T-pegs that I have aren't big enough, they aren't wide enough to properly secure these big weights. Now, every brand of big weight is different, but I have found that a lot of them, once you get into like the 1.5 ounce range, have such big holes on them that, you know, the T-pegs just do not fit properly in them. They're just not snug enough. So so that's another scenario that I use the bobber stop instead of the T-peg. So generally speaking, for bigger weights, and when I'm using a Texas rig where I'm using the little flipping beads, I'll put these in the description as well below. Another reason why I use those flipping beads is just create that clacking sound. So if I'm fishing like a Texas rig, even just a Texas rig worm on a lighter weight, and I'm working it through like a brush pile or working it through you know, grass or something like that, and I want that little bit of a rattle to pull fish away from the cover and go inspect and find that sound, that's when I'll use the peg or the bobber stop, just because it has that little range of motion that you allow it to have, and it can get that clacking noise. If you put it behind a T-pegged one, I mean, it's not going to hit that bead and make that sound. So anyways, however, there are times I like to use a T-peg again. And the T-peg to me is the best for baits that I'm really trying to get a good gliding action out of the bait on the fall. So for instance, like this, this Z-Man Bang Sticks, really good stick bait style bait. It doesn't have a lot of salt in it like the Zinkers or other stick baits would have, but what it does have is it has that nice kind of wide body, straight tail action. It's got a little bit of tassel action on the back too, just a little extra flair, I guess. But essentially, when you peg a weight to the nose, specifically with the T-peg method, it's going to have a nice horizontal gliding action on the fall. And I really, really like that, especially if I'm fishing things like deep brush piles and things like that, where I want to have, you know, I want to lift it up a few feet and let it glide back down and get that reaction strike. Really, really good way to peg that bait. Same thing goes for like, you know, tall standing grass or something like that, where I'm really lifting and letting that bait fall. You know, if I'm working it on the bottom and just shaking a bait, I'll probably use the bobber stop, because again, it allows that weight to rattle against that bead that I like to use. But if I'm really hopping, making large hops, I really like using the T-peg because it gives a good gliding action. With the bobber stop, the weight kind of falls like this. You know, it kind of tends to not really stay straight. So you could snug it up real snug, but then a lot of times you're kinking the bait, because the more you snug this up, the more it wants to kink. But just the nature of the T-peg, it can be super firm on there, and I can just barely meet the nose of that bait, and it's gonna, you know, the bait's not gonna be kinked up, and the weight is just gonna be falling straight down. So hopefully I explained that well, but in general, just kind of to condense that down, the T-peg allows a bait to glide better. So either one of these, you know, the T-pegs or the bobber stops, you can use them by themselves. Like you don't have to use both of these techniques, but if you're fine tuning things, you just pay attention to those. But anyways, guys, those are just some thoughts on, you know, pegging your weight to your line and some of the reasons why you might want to or may not want to. So yeah, those are just my thoughts on the topic. So thank you very much for the question. If anybody else out there has any questions at all, drop a comment below in the comment section. Also check out the links for everything that we talked about, the flipping beads from Fitzgerald, and as well as the T-pegs that I like to use, and the bobber stops. Check it out in the description below. So thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like, share, subscribe. I'm gonna see you out on the water. Trust the process.